we're going to look at some game mechanics from tabletop games. So this will help you start to think about some game mechanics and how you can apply them to your game-based lessons. I'm super pumped to share these with you. Some are from my own personal implementation, but before we do, if you have questions, leave a comment below and be sure to subscribe to Board Game with Education for future videos like this one. So let's talk about game mechanics. All right, before we dive into some examples of game mechanics, we need to define what is a game mechanic. Game mechanics help to provide gameplay by providing a construct of methods and rules for players to interact with. So essentially, a game mechanic is a system of rules or constructs that you interact with in order to play the game. So first up, we have the storytelling or role-playing mechanic. So these two mechanics are very similar. As a role-playing mechanic, you are role-playing as a character or avatar, where the storyteller is building the world that the players are interacting in. More than likely, if you use this mechanic or one of these mechanics in your class, you will assume the role of storyteller and your students will assume the role of role player. However, you may want to mix it up. You may find an opportunity where your students take on the storyteller role. This is a great mechanic for the classroom because you can implement simple language or characters as a part of your lesson. One simple way you might do this is have a character that shows up in the lesson. And as you lecture, the character comes again and shows up at a different time in the lesson. And the students might need to answer questions or solve puzzles related to the content that you're lecturing on to continue the progress through the story. Number two is the player judge mechanic. A lot of party games use this mechanic, and if you're familiar with Apples to Apples, it uses a player judge mechanic. In the game, everyone receives a card and the judge receives one card. The goal of the game is to choose the card that you think the judge will like best that matches the judge's card best. And at the end, after the judge receives all the cards from the other players, they choose their favorite card. So this is a player judge mechanic. I've used a similar mechanic in my class. I've talked about this in other videos where I use the game Snake Oil. Again, in Snake Oil, you are trying to create a product or invent a product based on two cards that you receive. You have to convince the other player or the customer to purchase your product. And at the end, the customer chooses which product they like best. So again, it's a player judge mechanic. This mechanic is excellent for using in the classroom because it involves all players in the learning process and the game process. As the judge, they're listening, and as the player, you're describing. So it's really awesome where everyone's involved, and it's very efficient and effective for game-based learning in the classroom. The next one, auction or bidding mechanic. I think a lot of us are familiar with this mechanic because it works or operates like an auction. You can decide how this mechanic operates though. You could allow students to bid an unlimited number of times. You can allow them to bid only once. It will really depend up to you. And you can even play around with this bidding and auction mechanic even further. Ask students to get up out of their seats, go to different parts of the classroom and place their bid down secretly, kind of like a secret or silent auction that you see at fundraisers. I've used this mechanic in the past at a summer camp. My wife and I were able to attend a summer camp and teach a summer camp off the island of Taiwan at a place called Jingmen. We used something called grammar auction. It's something I found online, but I was able to adapt it and kind of spice it up a little bit. So in the game, students had to bid on different sentences. Some sentences were grammatically correct, some sentences were grammatically incorrect. So the whole fun part about the lesson is they didn't know how much those sentences were worth unless they knew they were grammatically correct. If they're grammatically correct, they would be worth more at the end of the game, where grammatically incorrect would be worth less. And more complex sentences were usually worth more. So being able to keep an eye out for every grammatically correct sentence and making sure even the very complex sentences don't have minor grammatical errors. It was a very engaging game, and it involved everyone in the process of kind of checking out the sentences and seeing what sentences looked good, which ones didn't, and they worked in groups to kind of talk to each other and decide how much they should bid on each sentence. At the end of the game, it was really awesome, revealing how much the sentences were worth and then totaling up all the points together. The next mechanic, action selection. This is an awesome mechanic to create autonomy in your classroom. An action selection mechanic in a board game, for example, on your turn you have different options. Maybe you can fight, heal, rest. The board game that uses this that is actually one of my favorite is called Scythe. In this game, you have different actions you can take on your turn. You can build a building, you can deploy a mech, you can deploy farmers to help you with gaining resources in the game. So these are different options you can take on your turn. Now you might use this in your class as a way to incorporate autonomy by allowing students to choose different activities or tasks to complete in the lesson, or by answering different questions. Maybe you have an activity set up where they can go on different paths and select different ways to get to the end, and whoever gets to the end first wins. These are some ways that you can employ action selection. Next up is set collection. This is a fairly easy mechanic to employ. You might ask students to complete different tasks, and it allows them to collect cards to work towards completing their set. So in this mechanic, you're just collecting cards, items, or anything to create a pair or create a set. Set it up in a way that's similar to action selection, where students are completing different tasks or activities to work towards completing their set. And the next mechanic is called a deck builder. In a deck builder, you're collecting cards to create your deck. If you're familiar with the games like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Magic the Gathering, these are called collectible card games. They're a little similar to deck builders. The main similarity is that you're building a deck. But a deck builder is different because you don't go collect cards. All the cards are within the game system, and you build your deck through that game system. You're not building a deck maybe to fight other people, but advance your goal in the game, advance your progress further in the game. So it might not be to fight other people, it might be to build a deck to move across a board, it might be to build a deck to purchase art pieces to acquire your best art collection. So another mechanic similar to this one is kind of a bonus, is called a bag builder. The only difference between a deck builder and a bag builder is, you got it, you're building a bag. And in that bag you have different tokens that you add to the bag and you can draw out. So deck builders and bag builders are great for creating randomness. And I'm going to go into the next mechanic and show you how I used a deck builder plus the next mechanic. And the last one is boss battles. This is by far my favorite mechanic to employ. If I ever have an opportunity to do it, I try to include it in the lesson, usually at the end or as a review or something like that. So as a boss battle, I designed a lesson with my wife at a high school in Taiwan as well, and we created a deck builder review game soon to be released by Board Game with Education, soon as we get some more playtesters. If you're interested, send me an email, podcast@boardgamewitheducation.com. All right, but back to what the deck builder boss battle was. So I was helping my wife create a review game for her ESL high school grammar class. What students did to review is they created different grammar sentences in varying complexity and having to use some grammar points that they covered in class. For example, they might have to use a different tense, and some tenses were worth more points. So what they did, they created their sentence, and their sentence based on the complexity was worth a certain number of points. They showed myself or my wife the sentence, and they received points to purchase cards, and those cards they used to build their deck. That deck worked in two different ways. The first way is by gaining points as a group. So they were working in groups, and the group with the most points in their deck at the end wins. The other way, which was my favorite, was by creating a deck to fight the boss. So for the boss battle, the cards operated in two ways. One was to outsmart the boss, and one was to defeat the boss through power. So their cards all had an attack value as well as a knowledge value. And then there were some cards that were X's. If you got an X, you had to discard all your cards and you lost your knowledge and your attack power. So within the game, they had to draw their cards and decide how many cards to draw. If they drew an X, they lose all their cards, they lose all their attack power, they lose all their knowledge. So in order to beat the boss, they had to beat the knowledge number, which they knew, they saw it on the board, it was 15. So they could keep drawing until they get enough knowledge points to outsmart the boss. But if they get an X, they lose all their knowledge points. So that's one way they could have beat the boss. The other way was through attack. On the board, the boss had 6 hearts. Now what they could do is draw 2 cards. It's good, they have no X. So now they draw those 2 cards and they say, okay, our attack power is 6. Let's look at the first heart. If the first heart is under 6, they eliminate the first heart. They discard those 2 cards, but they were able to use them to attack the boss. So this was how I employed a boss battle in this particular example. Now there are a lot of other ways you could employ boss battles as well. For example, again, you could go back to the role-playing and storytelling element. You don't have to get super fancy by creating a deck builder game You can just have a character show up through the course of your lecture, and at the end, make them answer the most difficult question, the most complex question that you have for your lesson. The thing that shows them they are learning your outcomes, a way to assess what you are teaching them too. Something simple like that could be a way you can employ a boss at the end of your lesson. And one last point to make, check out some board games based on the content you're trying to teach. You might be surprised what some people have already came up with, and it might help you spark some ideas for your game-based learning lesson. If you are interested in a course that helps you employ some of these game mechanics to create a game-based lesson, check out the information below and be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one.